From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the treasure state was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the treasure state. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible for Change. And, we've done a huge amount of our analysis of the change period in Montana has been built around the Montana Constitution of 1972. It was a fulcrum upon which a huge amount of change occurred. We've talked about it all kinds of different ways during this series. And today we're going to take a look at kind of the almost aftermath. What happened after the delegates did their work on the Constitution? What about the shape of the ballot? What about the actual campaign to ratify the Constitution? What about the court cases that came as a result of a very, very close vote? This is an exciting part of the Constitutional Convention story, and we're blessed with two wonderful guests today, the youngest and the second youngest Constitutional Convention delegates. Maynann Ellingson. Maynann was Maynann Robinson at that point. Now she's well known around the state as Maynann Ellingson, and she was the youngest delegate out of Missoula. And joined by Mick McCune. Mick is from the McCune family in Anaconda, well-known political family, but was a young attorney, was the second youngest Constitutional Convention delegate out of Anaconda. So welcome to both of you to this series of In the Crucible for Change.
Thank you, Evan.
Thanks. Before we get too far into this, I wanted to ask you again to recap your reasons. Why did you decide to become part of a constitutional change in Montana? What motivated you to say, I want to throw my hat in the ring and run for this? And Mick, why don't you take that first? Why did you decide to do this?
I'll be happy to, Evan. I had just graduated from law school. I graduated in June of 1971. Nobody ever claimed that I was one of the outstanding students in my class, but
we don't have to, admit too much here.
That's as far as I'm going to go. But my family had been involved in politics. My dad had been the state senator from Deer Lodge County. My uncle Willis had been the county attorney up in Phillips County. I had a number of other relatives involved in politics, and they thought it was a good idea that I do it. They prodded me a bit. I jumped in and started campaigning, started debating, and became really interested in the vital issues that were before the people, and saw the opportunities there were for changes.
There were quite a few people ran in Anaconda Deer Lodge, as I remember.
There were.
Yeah,
there were.
So there was a high degree of interest in it.
There was extreme interest.
Yeah.
Large turnout. In the end, I think Deer Lodge County ended up with the largest plurality in favor of the Constitution in the state.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to your
question. What a marvelous opportunity as a emerging young attorney to have the chance to do this. I'm sure that that was something in some ways maybe your dad and uncle thought they could, but of course your dad couldn't run, could he?
Right. He was a member of the Senate.
So the previous Supreme Court decision that said if you're a sitting officer, including a legislator, you cannot run.
Right.
So there they said, you know, Mick, why don't you do it, huh?
I recognized the importance of it, the significance, well into the campaign, and was thrilled to be a part of it.
Yeah, that's good. Now, May Nan, you ran a extraordinarily strong second as the youngest person on the ballot there in Missoula. Tell us, what motivated you to even jump in on this thing?
Well, at the time, I was working on my master's degree in political science. So, and I had a great mentor with Dr. Ellis Waldron, and he was very interested in my education and, I guess, political career. I had just turned 24, which was the requisite age to run, and he said, you know, you really ought to do this. I think you would do an excellent job. And I thought about it and thought, well, why not? And I don't know if I really thought I had a chance, because like in Deer Lodge County, there was a great interest. Missoula County elected 8 delegates, but in the primary, started off with 64 people vying for those 8 seats in terms of all the people who had filed as Republicans, who had filed as Democrats, and then there was a healthy dose of independents from
Even
Missoula.
some new reform.
And new reform,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So out of the 64, in the general election, or in the primary, those were winnowed down to 24 in the primary. There were 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, and 8 independents. And how I ended up getting the second highest number of votes after John Toole, I don't really know. I just thank my lucky stars I did, though.
If I could interject, Evan.
Yeah.
May Nan was remarkable at the convention, absolutely remarkable. But just as remarkable is the fact that out of the huge number of incredibly well-qualified candidates who ran from Missoula County, the fact that she was second on the ballot, I found amazing.
Yeah, well, you know, by the way, some disclosure here. I've known both of you since all the way back then. In fact, I knew you when we were in graduate school. I was in graduate school. You were still an undergraduate
Right, exactly.
back then in 1968 or 67, 68. And then I've known you and your family all these years. And so we like to always say that let's disclose that we all know it. Montana is a small town with really long streets.
Yes.
The other thing is to mention that this is not an interview. This is a conversation. And so I'm liable to jump in and intervene and say something goofy, but feel free at any time to throw in. And if you want to head another direction, because these are important things to talk about. And as we got to the end of the Constitution, the election was held in November. And the convention convened on the 17th of January, 1972. And then you finished your work actually early, is that right?
Yes.
You saved a couple of days, and in that process saved a little money. Kind of a little nest egg there for some purposes.
About 45,000.
Yeah, and it was signed by all the delegates on the 24th of March. And the election was set for the 6th of June, the normal primary election.
Yes.
So there was just maybe 10 weeks. Maybe 10 weeks to campaign for this amazing document. But before it went to the ballot, there were some big decisions that were made inside the Constitution, some of which were pragmatic and some maybe philosophical, but there were 3 big side issues. So when it was on the ballot, there were 4 things: ratify and 3 other issues. Can we dive into those a little bit as to
Sure.
to what? Maybe let's start with the unicameral legislature.
Well, there were 3 side issues.
Yeah.
The first being unicameral, which means one house
Instead of there being a House and a Senate, there'd be just one legislative body.
Right. And I think it was
Nebraska.
designated as 100 delegates.
Yeah, and that was kind of patterned after Nebraska, which was deemed by many to be when we had a report and a discussion with the legislative committee, they said almost uniformly the Nebraska legislature was looked at as being perhaps the most functional in the nation, so why not have Montana do it? And furthermore, your body was a unicameral body.
Right.
Exactly.
So that was, but why was that put on the side instead of in the main document? Because the main document
may or may not disagree with me, but my recollection is that while the delegates, I think the majority of the delegates were for the unicameral legislature, we were concerned that the voters might not be. It was a highly controversial issue, and our concern, and this applied to the other side issues, was that it could bring the Constitution down.
If you had controversial stuff in it. And what was your take on the unicameral?
Well, I was in the legislative committee, and I was a big proponent of the unicameral legislature.
As was I, by the way.
And the majority of the people on the legislative committee recommended a unicameral legislature. But there were some really thoughtful Constitutional Convention delegates, Chet Blaylock for one, and Grace Bates for another, who really cautioned that if you put the unicameral legislature in the body of the Constitution, it's so unusual. It's such a significant change. I mean, there is only one other in the United States, that it would be just too much to bite off on. And even though I favored it, I agreed. I think that was totally right, that it probably would have been too much of a change for most people.
I think it would have been difficult for the voters to digest.
By the way, Grace Bates was a Democrat from Manhattan, and Chet Blaylock was a Democrat from Laurel.
Right.
Both highly respected people. Their voice must have been important in that. It seems to me that most citizens don't draw the lines of distinction between the structure of the state government and the structure of the federal government. And since the federal Constitution has a Senate and a House, I think it's fair to say, in my judgment, that most voters would have said, why are we not doing what is our great American tradition? And
I think the other really big argument for most people is that they have a rough understanding of checks and balances, and while they don't necessarily admit that it should be the legislature should check the executive or the judicial and vice versa, a lot of people really like the check and balance between the House and the Senate. I mean, you know, some of us would call that stalemate more than checks and balances, but that is a built-in it's just a built-in prejudice or limitation, I guess, that people want everything balanced.
Well, and if you think about it from a federal perspective, I mean, that was what the objective was. The objective was to not let the great unwashed run crazy through the House of Representatives with stuff. It had to get balanced out by that Senate over there, and
but of course all of that got wiped out. That whole rationale got wiped out in the late, 1966 with Reynolds versus Sims and Baker versus Carr, where you can't have voters representing cows. I mean, you've got to represent people in both houses of the legislature, so that historic reason for the upper house just disappeared after those court decisions.
From a legal perspective, however, I think one of the things we've discovered going through this series of programs is that reapportionment was a linchpin for a lot of the change that occurred in Montana, but it also built up a huge amount of resistance, particularly in the rural areas of Montana. And that was evidenced in the final vote on all this stuff. There was a significant rural-urban split, but we did put the unicameral on the outside. Mm-hmm. And that was a safety measure, so to speak, a pragmatic decision.
Yes.
Notwithstanding maybe the majority of the delegates wanting to go unicameral.
Right. If I could interrupt for a minute, ironically, at the Federal Constitutional Convention in 1883, unicameral legislature, a unicameral body was widely discussed. And seers such as Thomas Jefferson and others who opposed a House of Lords and a House of Commons, which they found repugnant, because the House of Lords literally bought the House of Commons.
In England.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were for a unicameral legislature.
But they didn't prevail down.
No,
by the way, here's the vote. Here's the vote on the unicameral. That was a side issue, so that a little over 56% voted against it, and a little bit under 44 voted in favor of it. So the margin was about a 27,000 vote negative on it. So it was fairly soundly defeated.
And I think we anticipated that.
And I think it does speak to the judgment and the pragmatism of the delegates who said, let's not hang ourselves out on something here. As much as we like it, this might be a bad decision.
There are plenty of other really good things in the Constitution that we wanted to save without subjecting it to that risk. Which
It would have been a really hard sell.
Yeah. Now, the other two things that were side issues. One was was kind of an economic issue, if you will, a little economic freedom issue, which was gambling, and the other one was more of a philosophical one, which was the death penalty. Let's talk about the death penalty, because that was put on the side. Now, it clearly was a very hot issue.
It is, and that's another one where I think practicality won out over the idealism of the delegates, because I'm pretty sure, and you could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that the majority of delegates, if they were voting their own conscience, would have voted to abolish the death penalty.
Nan's right.
And that, that was something that people really felt, the majority felt very strongly about, led in large measure by Reverend George Harper, and he gave some very impassioned pleas about abolishing the death penalty. But that was the issue that we received lots and lots of mail about. Do not abolish the death penalty. So again, I voted to have it as a side issue.
Yeah, as did I. We talked about this earlier, but when we'd go home on the weekends and have town meetings, that would always be one of the major topics of discussion in Deer Lodge County. And surprisingly, most of the people in Deer Lodge County were in favor of abolishing the death penalty, which surprised me. Yeah. It was such a visceral issue.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and guess what? Probably every delegate that was strongly in favor of it went to the ballot box and voted on it the way they wanted to within their conscience.
Yes,
but
sure.
Again, it's an interesting thing to look at this kind of mixture of pragmatism with policy and principle, because so much of the Constitution is about what are the right governing principles, and yet if you're not pragmatic about it, you may lose it all.
We had to be pragmatic. We felt so strongly that the document that we had written was so good and so beneficial to the crucible of change that you've mentioned that we couldn't risk it all, to use Rudyard Kipling's phrase, on one toss of the dice.
Yeah. Well, so what happened with the death penalty? Overwhelmingly retained. The question put on the ballot was, shall we retain it?
Right.
So a positive vote meant keep it. and little over 65% voted in favor of it and 34% against. So it was almost 2 to 1.
Yeah.
So I think it was probably, looking back on it, it's like, well, boy, that was obvious, huh?
I think we expected
But
that.
it's so interesting, isn't it, that every session of the legislature nowadays,
Yeah.
there is a bill introduced to repeal the death penalty.
And it's
And it-
still,
And
Yeah.
it's still, but it gets closer
Yeah.
every time.
and that you could make a case that perhaps it's a statutory issue anyway. I mean, you could make that with almost anything. It's a fairly high level issue.
Yeah.
But you guys were writing a basic document, and I suspect life is a big issue.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that it's statutory. I think it's appropriately constitutional.
But you
It can
guys
be
made
both.
the right choice.
It
You
can
guys
be
made the
both.
right choice from a pragmatic perspective. Now, the third side issue was gambling. Now, there is a hot button issue in Montana.
Right.
Everybody's got an opinion on that. And the issue was, shall we legalize gambling? Is the legislature going to be allowed to authorize gambling? Isn't that basically
Yeah.
how it was laid out?
Yes, yes, and I think what's so interesting about the contrast between this side issue and the other two side issues is that you could, if you were a one-issue person, you could vote against the Constitution and still have the death penalty. Same with the unicameral or bicameral legislature. I mean, you could vote against the Constitution and you're still going to have bicameralism. I mean, the irony about this side issue, and I think it might have been an irony that was lost on the people in Butte, because I don't think they got it, was that the only way you're going to get gambling is if you pass the new Constitution. And people just didn't grasp that because, I mean, if you look at the vote in Butte, now maybe there are other reasons for this, but Butte voted to approve gambling by 70% or something like that, whereas they only voted in favor of the Constitution by 47%.
Right.
So, I mean,
There's at least 28% of them didn't get it.
Yeah, at least.
Butte was an anomaly.
Yeah.
But
You would have expected Butte and Silver Bow and Deer Lodge County to vote in tandem.
The same. They didn't.
Didn't.
They did. Now, but I think that point is critical. Some people might have gotten it, that in order to get gambling, you've got to pass the Constitution.
I mean, we tried to tell people that for whom we knew gambling was a really big issue, that the only way you're going to get it is if you vote for the Constitution.
Let's explain why that's the case. That's the case because
Because
if you fail to pass the Constitution, you went back to the old Constitution,
Right.
you had the
which had a prohibition.
1889, so it had it's the same theory in a way. It had a bicameral legislature, so it allowed the death penalty,
No big deal.
but it prohibited gambling. So you were stuck, and what's interesting, it was about that time that the Attorney General was taking a pretty tough position on gambling, right? I mean, you couldn't,
Bob Woodall was chasing down the little old ladies
he's
playing
playing
bingo.
bingo,
Remember that?
and got his name Bingo Bob
Yeah.
because, so it was a big issue. And when you talk about it being an economic development issue, we really got a lot of letters from like the Chamber of Commerce and people up on the High Line wanting gambling as a way to attract Canadians to come into the state. And I think Dr. Waldron's book shows that there was a lot of favorable votes for the Constitution up on the High Line, right? Because of gambling.
There were, yes. Butte did not connect the dots. And there were dynamics at work in Butte that I don't think were prevail
Well,
in
when we
other
talk
counties.
about the larger passage or non-passage, the ratification, I think we're going to talk a little bit about why Butte was the anomaly among the urban centers of Montana, and there are some reasons for that. By the way, and speaking of disclosure, you mentioned Ellis Waldron, and you know, those who watch our series are familiar with this book that sits in front of me all the time. This is my Bible.
Okay.
And this is an Ellis Waldron book
Right.
that has everything and anything you'd ever want to know about any election of any kind in the state of Montana between 1889 and 1976. And so God bless him. And he was also on the commission, the Constitutional Convention Commission, that did the setup
Right.
of the Constitutional Convention. So he also, and just as a point of reference, was the supervisor for Chuck Johnson when he was in the 71 legislature, and wrote that wonderful thing he did on executive reorganization, which was a big part of our discussion with Chuck. So Ellis Waldron cuts a pretty wide swath
sure
through
does.
that period of time,
He
doesn't he?
sure
Yeah.
does.
What he wrote is brilliant.
Yeah.
And yeah, he was supervising my master's degree, which was doing a roll call voting analysis of the 1971 legislature.
Really.
Uh-huh.
Which, by the way, a totally side issue, was you found out in the 71 legislature what I found out when I was doing a voting record analysis of the 69 legislature, which is there was very little to analyze.
Very little to analyze.
Because
That's right.
of the rules, it said they didn't publicize the votes, and the only votes that seemed to be publicized were those third reading votes that were always 98-2.
Yeah.
You know.
You know, that, and I'm sure that you've covered this with Jerry Lindorf in terms of that being a huge, huge change. Maybe one of the biggest changes in our Constitution, the roll call voting.
Well, and not only that, but I think one of the things we did kind of conclude in that section was that the dysfunctionality of the legislature may have been one of the more obvious reasons the electorate was favorably disposed toward even calling a constitutional convention.
I agree.
Because it was like there were a lot of things wrong with it, but that was one people understood, was that it was pretty much a private club. But
Private club, although if they were rating it on dysfunctionality of the legislature, some would say it's probably time for another constitutional convention.
well, yeah.
But I don't.
There's a lot of danger in that, isn't there?
There's a lot of danger
The
in that.
lobbyists prior to the adoption of the Constitution were literally writing the bills that went before the Senate and House.
Yeah, there was certainly plenty of that stuff. Well, and by the way, when we talk a little bit about this period of progressive change in Montana, and then how to keep it that way is one of the subtexts of what we talk about here. But certainly dysfunctionality in Montana, whatever it might be, pales into insignificance next to the dysfunctionality apparently in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think that
And
is
so
true.
what do? You know, it's there's a lot of challenges in this governmental thing. But there we had three sidebar issues. The gambling thing, by the way, passed with 61% in favor of legalizing gambling and 39% against, and a 50,000 vote margin. So again, a wise, pragmatic judgment to put it out there that way. And even though Butte didn't get it, seemed like some other people did.
Yeah,
you
they
know?
A lot
did.
of people did, obviously.
Yeah.
So now the ballot is structured. Everyone signs. All 100 people signed it, even though some didn't agree with it. All 100 signed the Constitution. You had a few days to spare. You'd saved $45,000 to educate the electorate on it. What happened with the $45,000?
The Montana Supreme Court ruled shortly thereafter that money could not be spent to educate the voters.
Yeah. Well, what's your sense of that?
So, well, there wasn't a lot of time to sit on your hands
Nope.
and cry about it because the days were ticking off.
In fact,
until the election.
the
Right.
date that Supreme Court decision came, they ruled on the 21st of April that as someone in the Constitutional Convention wanted to run for state treasurer. And the Supreme Court said, you are a delegate until June 30th. Therefore, the two not holding concurrent, you can't run for something during that term. And they stopped it, that, and then a week later, which would have put it about the 27th of April. Now think about that, 27th of April, that's only 5.5 weeks in front of the election. They enjoined the expenditure of the money. So the money was hanging in limbo to that point. And they said, no, you can't spend it. So you had to cobble it together pretty fast.
And the plan of how some of that money was going to be used was the preparation and printing and mailing of a voter information packet.
An objective.
An objective. I mean, I think we took pretty seriously. It said to educate. It was for education. It really wasn't to proselytize or to take a position one way or the other. And so the work that was being done was just going section by section and repeating or showing what was in the old and showing what was in the new. And that was, in fact, the gist of the official campaign. I mean, we raised $10,000 and printed and mailed that 24-page document.
Now, I often disagree with what the Montana Supreme Court has to say, particularly this court in the early 1970s, but this ruling is a close call, and I'm not sure they were wrong.
I've had several members of the convention suggest to me that it might have been fortuitous that they said don't spend the money, because had the public money being spent, if that was misrepresented in the campaign as being, oh, look, they're taking your taxpayers' money and they're spending it to try to tell you what to do, that could have been the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to a close election.
I agree with that logic. I think the Supreme Court may have done us a favor.
Inadvertently.
Inadvertently, yeah. I think their motives might have been different, although I'm certainly not a seer.
Now, a little colorful story happened that when the Supreme Court ruled that, I believe on the 45,000, a newspaper reported that the president of the convention, Leo Graybill, criticized the court for it. And the Supreme Court hauled him up immediately in front of the court within a few days to censure him, or at least to
hold him in contempt.
Hold him in contempt,
ask why we shouldn't hold you in contempt.
Right. Now, I struggle with that. I've struggled with that for over 40 years. I don't think the Supreme Court has the power to go that far over something so innocuous.
Well, there are provisions in the Constitution for judicial remedies in the legal system, for judicial standards and for lawyer standards and so on, and conduct.
There's also a First Amendment.
But there is. Now, what happened was, as I remember reading, was that several of the major newspapers immediately hammered the court, saying, what are you doing?
Sure.
Trying to tell a guy that he can't express himself, because the press is very well known for defending the freedom of speech.
Right, exactly.
And lo and behold, by the time he got in front of the court, they very, very quickly put it to bed. They said, shame on you. And he said, I'm sorry.
Leo went in and made an apology. It was readily accepted by the court, and the issue was put to
bed.
rest.
And then we got on to selling the Constitution.
Right.
Let's talk about selling the Constitution. Beyond what we've heard many times, with the praise the Lord and pass the Constitution, which was what George Harper came up with.
Yes.
But beyond that, tell us about the structure of passing this Constitution. And was it $10,000? Doesn't seem like much today, but that was a decent amount of money.
That was a good amount of money.
It's a decent amount of money in those days. I remember Max Baucus in 1974, in his primary election for the Congress, spent $16,000.
Really?
So $10,000 wasn't bad, but it wasn't 47.
Right.
But what did you do? Did you set up a committee, or did you have an office? Or?
We did have that committee, and as I say, the big expenditure really was the publication and the mailing to every registered elector, that pamphlet. with respect to the actual ratification campaign, my recollection is that it was fairly decentralized. I mean, delegates would get invitations just to come speak, and I think all of the delegates just sort of took it on themselves that we're going to go and talk to as many people as we possibly can wherever we're asked. And there wasn't like any big, or I don't think there was like any big screening or any place in particular where you called and asked somebody to come.
No.
It was just word of mouth,
really,
and people locally would call, and can you come
kind of a
talk to us?
grassrootsy thing.
It was totally grassroots.
But there was rhyme and reason to it. We were all aware that the urban areas in the western part of the state were the sine qua non, that we had to have these areas. So when I'd receive phone calls to be somewhere, it was always an urban area or a college. And I think I probably spoke at least once a week until the Constitution was voted on. Yeah. I was continually on the road. Were you?
Yeah, oh sure. I think I counted up speaking more than 42 times, and I got to know Max pretty well because Max went with me and spoke, because by that time he was a staffer, and he liked getting out and helping explain the Constitution. There were some...
Plus, he actually, in addition to being a staff person for the Constitutional Convention, I think he was called the committee coordinator.
Yes.
He had, by that time, filed for the legislature, because he ran in 1972 in Missoula.
Right.
And was elected to the legislature.
Yeah, I don't think he had, well, I didn't know that he had filed by that point.
He had to by then, because he had to run through the primary in June.
I think Max's motives were mixed.
But, well, sure.
Well, of course.
I'm not critical.
But you were out there, campaigning, and you were mixing with Max.
And I also recollect that there were some debates, too, that even though Missoula was urban, you know, there's some rural areas out 9 Mile and Frenchtown, and even down the Bitterroot and the farm. The Farm Bureau, of course, was very, very opposed to the Constitution. The Farmers Union, not so much. But I remember debating someone from the Farm Bureau at different places. Several times.
They were the primary
debates.
opponents.
Right.
The Contractors Association was a big opponent, and I think everyone has kind of accepted de facto that the Anaconda Company and the kind of economic powers that be that flourished under the old Constitution were opposed to it, but they were not openly opposed. There was this kind of sub rosa opposition, but it evidenced itself predominantly in Butte, where in Butte you had a 68% vote or 71% vote.
Yeah, in Deer Lodge County.
In Deer Lodge County. Well, in Butte, right next door, they got 47%.
Right,
and that was probably indicative of the Montana Power and Anaconda Company saying, well, we don't need this thing.
Yeah, and their mantra was jobs.
It had to be that, because, you know, when you look at all of the major battles, or the popular battles that the Butte delegation entered into during the convention, I mean, they won. I mean, the Butte delegates were very much in favor of the convention, of the Constitution. So, yeah, it had to clearly have been something sub rosa, as you say, because they were out there working very hard for the Constitution.
Well,
you have to recognize the number of people the Anaconda Company still, and the Montana Power, and some other corporations employed in Butte. And they were...
When you raise the specter of, is your job maybe in danger?
You bet. You bet.
That's
a powerful incentive to keep your job.
That, by the way, is part of the story of the first 75 years of Montana,
It is.
which the crucible of change was about modifying.
Right.
Was that in our first program we talked about what was that 75 years and what was that copper collar all about?
This wasn't as violent, overt, but it was much more subtle, but it was every bit as real.
But there's no other way to explain the Butte vote.
Totally
other than that.
inexplicable.
I mean, it
otherwise.
just makes no sense.
Right.
So
'Cause
clearly,
every urban area passed it.
Yeah.
Every urban area.
And I have to be honest with you, Evan. I thought Butte Silverbow or Silverbow County would go the way Deer Lodge County went.
yeah. Oh,
It
how,
always does.
oh, how naive you were at that time.
Yeah,
on
I was
that.
a young, naive.
Yeah.
It is shocking, really,
Yeah.
when you think about it.
Well, let's talk about that overall vote because the urban areas, the campaign was conducted. It was very much grassrooty. There was some coordination out of, I think, an office they had in the Colonial Inn. Some of the male delegates have told me that the women were way ahead of the curve on this stuff and really had their eye on ratification way earlier than a lot of the men delegates and how they were going to argue it and get a team together to talk about it. But,
I agree with that, by the way,
Yeah.
Evan, 100%.
you know,
The women delegates, when we came to the Constitution, were way ahead of everybody else.
and as we've noted, by the way, they broke down the doors, so to speak, from a legislature which used to have one, two, or
One,
three women to all of a sudden 19 out of the 100.
Yeah.
And then from that point forward, you know, the doors were broken down.
I'm digressing a bit, but we were looking for our seats, and the women delegates were halfway through preparing the Constitution.
Now, by the way, the ratification vote came out very tight. And that is part of the ongoing saga that we have to discuss here. It was 116,000 plus to almost 114,000. The difference was 2,500 votes. It was 50.55% to 49.45%. So there you go. It passed, or did it pass? And that is the whole controversy. Now apparently it went to the governor for the governor to sign it and say the election results and say, I certify these results and
he
give
did.
them to the Secretary of State. And he signed it and he sent it over to the Secretary of State, Frank Murray, who said, I don't think it passed.
Right.
And I'm not going to recognize the governor's signature anyway,
Right. And
which was an interesting side thing because the governor then said, oh yeah? And he marched down the hallway and sat himself down with his staff and said, bring that Frank Murray in here. I'm going to sign it right in front of him. And he did it a
bit of
second
theater.
time. Yeah, a bit of political theater.
Right.
But Murray alleged that there was not enough votes for the body of the Constitution. That was an interesting challenge, and it went right to the courts. Tell us about it.
it went to the Montana Supreme Court first. We prevailed. Proponents of the Constitution prevailed before the Montana Supreme Court 3-2. Me and Ann and I have discussed this. If you read the 1889 Constitution, I have to be honest, it was a close call.
It was an arguable issue. Now, the
Yeah.
issue was that when you added the number of people voting in the sidebar issues, the gambling and so on, more unusually, but more voted for the hot button issues than voted for on the main issue. And therefore, you could say, gee, not half of the voters who voted
Right.
voted for it.
Right.
Is that the crux of it?
Exactly. So the court made a determination that they were going to look at whether the Constitution passed by looking at whether a majority voting on that issue.
The Constitution
On the
itself.
Constitution itself,
Itself.
where a majority of those voted on it, so they narrowed it down. Now, I mean, what the old Constitution said was it would pass, it would be deemed to be passed if it was voted by 50% of those voting at the election.
Yes.
So, I mean, reasonably, I think the court could have literally interpreted it the other way. But when you look at it as a practical matter, it's confusing how all of that got presented, and probably the fairest way, I mean, I do believe the fairest way to determine what the voters intended about approving the Constitution was on that question itself. Shall the new Constitution be passed or not? So clearly, a majority of the people voted in favor of approving the Constitution. Because to rule the other way, it gives too much power to a no vote.
Yeah. While I agree with everything Manaz says, the court wrote a lengthy decision and did bring to the attention of the reader the fact that there was authority out there from other jurisdictions that held opposite our position. So the court could have followed other precedent from other states and ruled that the Constitution did not receive an adequate number of votes.
Well, and not only that, even when you look at the language of the 1889 Constitution, there was one section where they actually the framers used a more precise term of like voting on the issue. And in this clause, they didn't use voting on the issue. And so, I mean, that also kind of makes you think, well, maybe they should have held the other way because these people voted at the election.
But this speaks kind of to the issue of precision of legal language.
Oh, yeah.
That what better example of be careful how you write something.
Exactly.
Maynan and I just took a few minutes before we started our discussion to reread that section, and we both turned a little pale.
Yeah, yeah.
It was close. It was a close
Well, you know,
call.
let's take a look at the court, too, because this almost sounds like a 1972 Montana version of the Roberts Court in D.C.
Sure.
Where virtually all the hot-button decisions come down 5-4. This was a 3-2. And the court in the early 70s had James T. Harrison Sr., who was the Chief Justice, and Wesley Castles, who was the more senior of the associate justices. And I think it's fair to say that in the political world of the time, everybody knew, if there is such a thing as knowing, or fully expected, that they almost always came down on the sides of the vested economic interests of the state.
Absolutely.
And the track record was
long
just,
and long,
yes.
long.
And then you had Frank Haswell, who was a district judge in the Flathead, who had been appointed by Tim Babcock, was a very progressive guy.
Yeah.
Later became the Chief Justice. And Gene Daly, who was a Democratic county attorney from Great Falls, who was appointed by Forrest Anderson.
And extremely liberal.
And everybody looked at those guys and said, oh, they'll probably be for this Constitution, so they'll try to find a way, which left the man in the middle was John Conway Harrison, the second Harrison on the court, who was from East Helena, who was a Lewis and Clark County attorney before becoming a judge, and always seemed to be the guy that was either tilting this way or that way. And the way that decision was written, you could almost think that they had written it to have the decision go the other way.
I'm going to sit here right now, some 42 years later, and say that the decision was political. Do you agree?
Political. Well, that's not bad politics. That may be
good politics.
That's good.
Good politics,
but
you're right. I wasn't being facetious. The fact is, the way the 1889 Constitution read, and the precedent that was out there on both sides, left the decision open to politics.
now,
But Well, I don't know what you mean by that exactly.
I'm
If you
talking
mean-
liberal and conservative. If you look at,
Okay, as opposed to somebody being bought.
oh, I'm not,
Okay,
I'm not saying
okay.
that. No, definitely not.
I mean, I certainly think if you are trying to give weight to what the voters have just done, as opposed to legalese, you would have voted the way the court did. Because it's really clear. I mean, the vote on the Constitution itself, to me, that is the issue. Did more people favor this Constitution or disapprove of it? More people favored it. And I think it would have been a more strict constructionist position to say, well, notwithstanding the fact that the majority of the people voted in favor of the Constitution, we're going to go over here and say it didn't pass because all these other votes tally up.
Yeah, but you're going to agree with me that the language was such that there was an ambiguity.
Absolutely an ambiguity. Absolutely an ambiguity.
And that left room for
interpretation.
You bet. And if you look at the way the members of the court who traditionally voted with the conservative element in the state voted, as opposed to the more liberal element, I think that my opinion that it was political is apparent.
I'm going to now, as the only non-lawyer at this table,
and maybe I've said something now highly controversial.
No. I mean, I've heard, you see, it's an arguable issue. However, it would strike me if I would put myself in the head of John C. Harrison, and I want to ask you a little bit about, one of you told me something sketchy he said about John, who was a very honorable guy, but put myself in the head of John C. Harrison and look at it, as you said, that is that the vote on the main issue was clearly a win, and that to say it was a loss required a lot of a little bit of this twisting and turning. That would you want to be known as the guy who said we just defeated a constitution on a what the public would see as a technicality?
No.
You know, and so I wonder if he didn't think that.
I don't know what anybody thought.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you want to be seen either as the guy who
passed it on a technicality.
Passed it right, or defeated it on a.
And the interesting thing is, and the tenor of the times may have been part of it as well too.
Sure.
Remember, we're talking about a period of dramatic change going on, not just in Montana, but across the entire country. There was a lot of real significant change going on, and blocking that change would have been an interesting thing after all that effort.
No.
But that being said, once the Supreme Court of Montana said 3-2, it was done. The opponents, who were predominantly at that point the Farm Bureau, which represented the rural interests, which were strongly voting against this kind of change, they went to a federal court.
Right.
Is that right?
Immediately.
Yeah. And we had two federal cases.
Right. Both of which raised different legal arguments than the argument that was raised before the Montana Supreme Court. I've read the decisions. The decisions deal with the 14th Amendment. They're so obfuscated, obscure, that they're almost nonsensical. And
nonetheless, they were made.
They were made.
And it took how long? Was it almost a year later?
Another year.
Yeah.
Another year.
So we actually, the implementation date of the Montana Constitution was to be June 30th of 73. Is that correct?
Right.
Right.
It was adopted in early June of 72. It was then
June
implemented
6th.
a year later. Just before that, the final federal court ruling occurred.
Yes.
So right up to that point, there was at least the possibility
that it hadn't passed.
Even though there had been a subsequent legislature to...
Right. And I also think that I was very scared up until the Montana Supreme Court ruled, but I really felt that the argument that they made before the federal court, and I wasn't a lawyer then, didn't have much merit. I mean,
It had none.
after all, we were interpreting the Montana Constitution, and so the federal court had to really find a federal constitutional issue. And they really, it was just hard to make the case that the Montana Supreme Court shouldn't be the final arbiter of whether a Montana Constitution had passed.
If you think about it, Evan, the voters passed the Constitution. The Montana Supreme Court, albeit 3-2, upheld the Constitution. A federal court wasn't going
Not
to.
likely.
No.
Yeah.
No. And then, of course, I'm getting maybe ahead of us, but then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court on a what's called a writ of certiorari.
Take it up, please. Right.
Yeah. And a writ of certiorari is an appeal often used and extremely rarely granted.
Yeah. Now let me ask you guys, because
yeah.
we're getting close to the end here, and I want to ask you to give a quick reflection on what it meant to you as a young, emerging young attorney to be in this constitutional convention, and what it meant to you as an attorney, just very quickly.
You know, Evan, after the Constitution, I'm being honest with you, I got on with my life. I had a family. I had to support myself. I started a law practice, devoted decades to building, I think, a very successful law practice. As the decades went by, I began to ponder and cogitate about what I'd been part of. And I had a telephone conversation with Marshall Murray, God bless him, who called me from Oregon because he couldn't make our convention. And he said, in June, he said, Mick, he said, the older I get, the more proud I am. And the more I think about the wonderful things that we did. And I said, Marshall, you've taken the words from my mouth. I think
Yeah.
of all of the things in my career, and there have been some great successes. The most important thing happened when I was 25.
Yeah. Now, Maynann,
You agree?
I'm going to ask you, because you were a graduate student. You've often said to me that your appetite for becoming an attorney came out of this constitutional convention. Is that right?
Well, not only my appetite, but sort of the wherewithal to even do it. Two things happened. One, I really saw the power that lawyers had, and people really deferred to them in terms of debate, even if what the lawyer was saying wasn't all that valid. I didn't think so. There was an unwieldy a disparity of power just by virtue of being a lawyer that I became totally aware of. But the real thing for me in terms of being a lawyer is one day Marshall Murray came over to me and said, you know, I think you should, some of us have been talking and we think you should go to law school, and I don't know how much you know.
Eventually you did.
And I did, and because Dave Drum, a delegate to the convention, gave me the money to go.
Really?
That's an amazing story. By the way, we are running out of time, and I want to thank both of you for your insights about this wonderful ending, an interesting ending of the Constitution in the crucible of change.
You know, I think I speak for both of us. It's been a wonderful experience, Evan. And it warms my heart to
Share it with
rehash,
Evan.
or share it with you and share it with the viewers.
Thanks.
Thank you.